Hey guys, welcome to book review number 67. Yeah, 67. Today I'm going to be reviewing Mishima's Sword by Christoper Ross. The subtitle being Travels in Search of a Samurai Legend. Now, what this book was about was Christoper is an Englishman who has spent some extensive time in Japan, and as part of a book project, or an interest, I should say, he had from a small child, that being in the martial arts, in particular a writer, Mishima, who he read as a young man. He decides to go to Japan to find out about this famous author who famously killed himself in traditional Japanese suicide called seppuku, I believe. It's seppuku. Well, in any case, yep, seppuku, where they slice the belly across and then let your innards bleed out, at which point you're beheaded. The first part of the book is sort of dedicated to Mishima himself, a homosexual bodybuilding exhibitionist writer who, while critics kind of pan him at times for being a little too pulling too many stunts or too much of an exhibitionist, is generally regarded as one of the greatest post-war writers in Japan, and is hugely popular among the general populace. Now, his popularity has fallen off somewhat in the fact that he committed suicide in the late 1960s, and really his time of writing, or the time that he was most famous as a writer, was from the post-World War II period. I think his first major accomplishment was in 1948 until his death in 1967. But anyway, Chris talks about how kind of strange this man was, how different he was. He grew up kind of as a recluse, not by his own choice, but one, by health, and two, by people seeing his health, and therefore his parents and grandparents decided to encloister him. And also just, he went from this kind of very strange beginning that he didn't really interact with any classmates. He noticed early on he was attracted to other boys or other men instead of women. But one thing that's kind of true throughout his lifetime is he appreciated the kind of ephemeral nature of women if he wasn't necessarily attracted to them. He was attracted to women in the same way that, like, a rose is beautiful or something like that, but not in a sexual way. He was attracted to men sexually. Also, Mishima was known as, Mishima, I shouldn't say Mishimasha because that's not right. Mishima was famous as sort of a narcissist, in that he was a homosexual, but he was being more concerned with his own pleasure than he was with any sort of relationship or pleasure with other people. Matter of fact, Christoper Ross said that he was very much, in his exhibitionism, an idealist, somebody that kind of saw the world as only through his own eyes instead of through interaction or a more realist approach. Other things about Mishima, his early writing is much more confessional, kind of almost autobiographical, whereas later he became sort of a hack writer. A lot of his writings that were most popular in Japan that were never translated and were just kind of these boilerplate, romances or novels or things meant for kind of the I don't want to say the base populace, but then a percentage of his work was dedicated to a much more literary vein. There's a little kid behind me. A much more literary vein, such as I can't remember any of the titles, and I'm not going to be able to see it in the book. The second half of the book, and then I guess one final thing I should mention is so towards the end he became much more potboiler, but it was also around this time period that he became much more nationalistic, in that he was viewing that modern Japan, which was seen as kind of wishy-washy, and now homosexual lifestyle you would say is wishy-washy, but from a sadomasochist point of view, Mishima, and he was into that kind of stuff, and mentioned, and he went to those kind of clubs, was much more sadist, was much more somebody that was the aggressor, was much more somebody that was the top, if you will, if you want to use that terminology. So he saw Japan as getting too wishy-washy, too much, they signed a constitution that was basically dictated by Douglas MacArthur. They weren't allowed to have a standing army. It was just a Japanese defense force. And it was just sort of the kind of, taking the teeth out of the culture, in which case Mishima, in a lot of his writings, noted the warrior past, noted the kind of war society past that Japan had often been in, specifically under the shogunates, and even during its military during World War II. Now, I don't think Mishima was necessarily saying that what was going on with World War II was okay, but I think he saw that Japanese society was kind of giving a false front to its history and what it really was. So towards his final time, he decided to create a 100-person army. Now you might not, or militia, you might not think that that's very much, but he tried to create a larger army, but he knew he would have to negotiate his principles, whereas by keeping his army small, he was able to be it purely his baby, his project. Anyway, the second half of the book is dedicated to the sword itself. The title of the book is Mishima's Sword. And this is where Christoper kind of talks a little bit more about his time in Japan, and kind of this wild goose chase that he went on to try to get this sword, going through Roppongi Hills and Shibuya, and kind of all of the typical hangouts, known places in Tokyo, all the really high density urban areas. Now, it should be mentioned that Christoper spent 5 years as an English teacher in Japan, and that sneaks in a little bit through here too. This is definitely not just a historical account, which actually makes the book a lot better. It's a historical account mixed with Christopher Ross's experience of chasing down this sword, as well as some of his past experiences in Japan, be it with the Yakuza gangsters or with just any one of a number of oddball characters, kind of the bars, and really kind of almost, I would say, the backpacker / English teacher scene. But it's not a book about that, but I feel it's good because it gets a little bit of that in there too. The correct way to eat ramen, all that kind of stuff. But he also talks about some of the traditional Japanese things, you see, I think in sumo, you see a lot of times they tie a loincloth, and there's a specific name for it around their waist. He has a short chapter dedicated to that. He has a chapter, or extensive chapters, dedicated to the history of sword making, be it the blade or how it's kind of dying out, or not really how it's dying out, but how it used to be functional and now it's merely sort of swords are more like art pieces. And in such, there are fewer people that are making swords. I think Christoper said maybe 20 to 25 total could be profitable, and sword making as a profession in Japan, traditional Japanese sword making, but that those swords that sold well would sell for the thousands and thousands of dollars. So it could still be, for a very small sliver of society, a way to make a living. And so he kind of chases the sword down. He chases a lot of people associated with the death scene too. Mishima's death was very graphic, in that the seppuku, the way he killed himself, essentially went wrong. Not only that, being the exhibitionist that he was, he didn't do it in the private of his own home, but actually took a Japanese general public, or hostage. Public took him hostage and demanded that people watch him, and he was committing seppuku as a protest. There's a specific word for that too, in order to protest against the kind of effeminated government of the time. Him doing this, taking the general hostage in his own compartment. Now, he wasn't going to do anything to the general, but it was more just to draw attention to himself. He also gave an extensive speech before he killed himself about the need for Japan or for people to rise up, and put a right-wing kind of nationalistic government back in power. So yeah, that was real grisly. Christopher Ross, he also kind of looked at some of the people around it. You know, one of the things that's kind of throughout the book is how blackballed he was in all of these attempts, and kind of the if you know anything about Tokyo, it's very modern in that you can get around on the subway lines, and you can get anywhere, and in a lot of ways business is very open and friendly. But in a lot of ways, kind of, they have all these little corners and all these little back roads that are all these kind of strange office buildings that you don't know exactly what's going on. And Chris kind of inhabits that for a while, so that was pretty interesting. Anyway, the book ends with his own death, and then Christopher winds up finding the sword, or he thinks he does, but if he doesn't know if it's a hoax sword or it's the actual sword. It's not really verified. There's kind of this skeezy character who doesn't want to identify himself, and also demands not to have anything verified that takes him to the sword would be in the same shape, the same description as the sword Mishima used to kill himself. But it was a hoax. Maybe it wasn't a hoax. But anyway, okay, so I've been rambling on long enough. There's a lot more to this book, but it was a good book. Not just a historical piece, not just travel literature, but kind of a combination of both, with a lot of insight to Japanese society, as well as the namesake himself, Mishima, the famous writer. So anyway, thanks guys. See ya. Bye.